I don't like change. Now, I see a lot of shocked faces out there. I also see some people nodding, so thank you for being with me on that. Let me continue that thought. I don't like change when it's your idea. I'm a relatively smart guy, I like to think, and if the change is my idea, I think we should be doing it, and I think we should be doing it now. But if it's your idea, it becomes a little more disruptive to me, and it's going to take me a little longer to adapt to that process and to what you want me to have you do. Linda Hoops describes resilience as the ability to absorb multiple changes. Now, multiple changes can happen in what I call the square of life. They can happen in the context of our health, so not just our physical health, but our mental, our emotional, our spiritual health. It can also happen in the context of our wealth and our abundance. And I just don't mean wealth and abundance of money, but abundance of time, how much energy you have. It can also happen in our love life, and not just our romantic love life, but our family life, our friend life, our colleagues that we work with, their lives. So disruptive change can happen there. And last but not least, and certainly this is probably where a lot happened in your life as well as in mine, is when we express ourselves. And that might be at work, it can be in our hobbies, and it can also be in our volunteer time. Now what I've learned is this, is that we all have a standard pattern in how we respond to disruptive change. Now, while it may seem that some people are born with the capability to handle multiple changes, what the research shows is that we can all learn to be resilient and all develop new behaviors and new skills to handle those multiple changes. We all have a standard pattern, and what we want to do is we want to be able to break that pattern and be more strategic in how we respond. Because the reality is, if we get stuck with the change, it can become a problem for us, and it can become a problem for the organization we work for, or our friends, or our family, wherever we're stuck. So another way to think about this presentation is a 4-step process to help you or others get unstuck. Thanks for going through that activity. Now, as you all notice as we were going through those changes, we all tend to revert back to the way we are when we don't have the systems or supports in place to support us through that change. One of the things I like to think of as change is like a wave. So how many of you have been to the beach? There might be a lake or the ocean, and you've seen a wave, maybe not this big, but a big wave that's coming along to crash along the shore. Now, along the shore, you usually have a sandy beach. You also will often have boulders and a pile of rocks, depending where you are. Now, when that same wave crashes against the shore, it looks different when it crashes on the pile of rocks compared to when it crashes on the sand. The wave is the wave, the change is the change. Now, that's the same in an organization. You have a change coming along, and depending where you sit in the organization, how that change looks when it impacts you is going to be different. It's all about the change is staying the same. It's how our individual response is to it. Now, our individual response is not about all the bells and whistles that are going on out there with the change. It's about what's happening with us. And one thing I've learned is this, is that change happens in the mind of the other person. It's not about you. It's not about the person implementing the change. So you can sing, you can dance, you can throw things, you can talk louder, faster, you can show more slides and give more rationale. Until the change clicks in their head, it is not going to happen for them. Donald Hebb, a Canadian neuropsychologist, coined the term Hebb's Law. And what Hebb's Law states is that neurons that fire together wire together. So all your skills, your behaviors, your thinking, your thoughts, your actions, all that stuff are those neurons firing together. Now, while they may seem hardwired, like I said, they are not. We can actually change our neurons and how they fire. We can change our skills. We can change our behaviors. And you all have experience doing that, or you wouldn't be in your jobs. Now, with the context of resilience, what we want to know is we're going to be able to choose a different response than we normally would when disruptive change happens, regardless of where it happens in our lives. Now, some of you may say, what about my personality? Well, your natural self will most likely always want to assert itself. I have what I call an inner demon, and it sits inside me about here, and it usually comes out when I'm in meetings. You may have something similar. You might not call it a demon, you can call it whatever you like. For me, this little inner demon starts to come out, and I feel it coming out my throat when people across from me are saying stuff to me that I think is dumb, that I think is not a good idea, that I think is not even relevant to why I'm at that meeting. And there's this little creeping thing, this demon that comes out that wants me to tell them to shut up. And I have to manage that, because I can guarantee you I wouldn't be in my job if I let that come out. Now the reality is, I had to learn how to manage that. So I had to practice new responses so that an inner demon didn't come out, because it used to come out when I was a kid, and I'd get in trouble for it. And remember, to build those neurons firing together, we need to practice it. So the more you practice a new response, the more likely you're going to have access to it during disruptive change. You don't need to go on autopilot. We all have an in-flight monitoring system buzzing around our heads, which is called our neocortex. And just like on an aircraft, which has an in-flight monitoring system that monitors the air, the oxygen, the heat, the temperature, you don't really know it's there unless something goes wrong. And you don't really want anything to go wrong, of course, when you're on a plane. We have that same in-flight monitoring system going on with us. So how many of you have driven to work, as an example, and you get to work and you don't really know how you got there? Have you ever done that, driving up the highway, you're like thinking about work, an important meeting you got going on, and you get to work and you have the 15 minutes or half an hour, whatever it is, has gone by, and you're like, oh, how did I get here? You've been thinking the whole time around what's going on. You actually have something that's monitoring you, you just don't know that it's there. And when you know that it's there, you can start to use it to your advantage. You're not always on autopilot. You might feel like you are on autopilot, but you're not. And remember, change that's not your idea is usually disruptive. You know, when it's your idea, you think it's a good idea, so you want to do it. The interesting thing to note is that physiologically, your body responds the same way, whether you win the lottery or lose your job. Now, what's interesting about that is your cortisol level rises, your adrenaline level rises, and yet it's our interpretation of that response, our interpretation of the change, that determines how we're actually going to respond to it. Now, one of the things I know is that our job generally isn't to problem solve people's emotions, unless you're actually trained to do that, and I'm not trained to do that. You know, there's EAP programs, there's therapy, there's things like that that you would send people to. But one of the things that we can do is listen, acknowledge their emotions related to the change, and we can also work with them on their actions. So let's look at this slide here, and as you'll see on the slide, there's someone that has low resilience, and you'll also see up there that someone has high resilience. Now, let me give you an example of someone that's got low resilience. See, they're humming along, and you'll see what happens is the disruptive change happens, and then what happens is there's a long period of unproductive behavior. Look how long that is. And their period of recovery is quite long compared to the person beside them that's just a little shorter. And you see their period of recovery there is a little short. So let me give you an example. My parents are both very active people and were very active people in their community. They went to church. The reality is with this is that you can apply the characteristics that you used to be resilient from one part of your life to another part of your life. So what I want you to do is I'd like you to turn to the person beside you just for 30 seconds. I want you to think of someone you know that's highly resilient. So someone that's able to handle multiple changes, that's able to deal with lots of different things. I just want you to talk about for 30 seconds, what are some of the attributes that they bring to this? So some of the attributes you talked about probably are similar to what some of the research shows. So what the research shows is people tend to be positive in their outlook. So when disruptive change happens, they don't immediately go to a negative place. Additionally, people tend to also be able to focus on solutions, so they become solution focused, not always focusing on the problem. And sometimes you've got to focus on the problem. I mean, if your boat is leaking, you want to do some problem solving and plug that hole. Yet the reality is if we want to do some solution-focused thinking, we want to be able to ask the higher level questions around how did that hole happen, how can we prevent it from happening again, and so on. The other attribute that you probably talked about is being open to new ideas and flexible in our thinking and not too rigid and stuck in our mindset. Let's look at a scenario that would be disruptive. So I'm going to throw a slide up here. And what I'd like for you to do is I want you to put yourself in this space and in this mindset. So picture this. It's 4 or 5 o'clock. You're driving home from work. You know, you assume if you've got kids that are at home, or if you've got a cat or a dog or an iPad or an iPhone, you know, you've got all that stuff in the house. You know, you're looking forward to getting home and getting dinner started or watching TV or whatever you like to do when you get home. And you come across this. You've got a burnt down house. So what I'd like for you to do, turn to the person beside you and just quickly talk about 15 seconds. What are some things you would do to help adapt to the situation? Now, not the emotion, because I know you'd be shocked about it and upset. I'm okay with whatever emotion you have. But what would you use to adapt to this? What are some things that you would do? What probably most of you talked about is that you prioritize. You might not have used this language, but you probably asked the question, did everybody get out that needs to get out? Did all the people get out that had to be out of that house? Probably most of you weren't going, oh yay, I get to get a new house, I'm so excited, I'm so happy my house burned down. Most likely you weren't doing that. Let's talk about timing of these as well. You have a well-meaning neighbor who comes up to you. They see your house burned down, you're standing there, you know, you're phoning people, you're trying to figure out, you know, who do I call, where do I stay, you know, are my kids okay? All those things that you're trying to do to get on top of the situation. And a well-meaning neighbor comes up to you and says, hey, it's not so bad. It was just material things. You know, at least you have your health and at least nobody was hurt. How does that make you feel? What do you want to do? You want to boff them in the head and you want to say, my house just burnt down. I just lost all of my photographs, all of my heirlooms from my mom and dad, all the stuff from my grandmother. Everything's gone, and yeah, I'm happy people's okay, but I don't want to have a positive spin on things right now. That's what you're really saying in your head, or you're being very polite and going, oh, thanks. Let me give you another example that you may have experienced in your life. I was at a friend's mother's funeral many years ago, and I was watching the receiving line afterwards. And what was interesting was people were coming up to my friend Rob and shaking his hands and his family's hands and saying stuff like, oh, you know, it's so good she didn't last much longer. She wasn't very healthy. And wasn't it a good thing she died when she did? You know, it would be awful to stay in that hospital for a long time. And, you know, it's a good thing she's in a better place. Now, that always sounds like good platitudes on the surface, and yet the reality is people don't want to hear a positive spin at the funeral. What's going on is they really want to just hear, I'm sorry for your loss. Because what my friend was going through, and I talked to him about this afterwards, is he said to me, he's like, why did everybody try to come up and tell me it was a good thing? I just lost my bloody mother. I don't want my mother to be dead. And she's gone. So yeah, she's in a better place. Yeah, we know all the rational reasons for that. And yet it wasn't the right time to put the positive spin on it. One of my clients, a number of months ago, realized that at work they'd been putting a positive spin on this restructuring that was going on. And while it is good to talk about the positive and the rationale for doing something, what we don't want to do is gloss over the negative. So I'm going to exaggerate this just to prove a point. You may know the rational reasons why there's a restructuring going on and why there needs to be layoffs. You know, but are you really going to have a meeting that you go in and go, hey, guess what, everybody? I'm going to lay off 50% of the staff just so we can stay in business. Isn't that great? Yay, half of you are going to use your jobs. I'm so excited that half of you won't be here anymore. How does it make you feel? Not very good. So that's an exaggerated example of putting a positive spin on things when we shouldn't be putting a positive spin. Sometimes we want to acknowledge the negative and acknowledge what's going on, as well as giving the rational, more realistic outlook for what's happening related to that. Because change is not always roses and lollipops. Sometimes bad stuff happens. So we just have to be at peace with that. Let's look at the second step to help us get unstuck and develop our resilience intelligence. One of the things we need to do is to get clear on the difference between problem solving and acknowledgement. How many of you have ever had a bad day at work? Maybe not where you work now, but where you used to work before. Now, I see a show of hands, and I can certainly put my hand up because I have bad days at work where I work now too. Now, how many of you, after your bad day at work, have phoned someone up and gone, "Hey Pete, I've had a really bad day at work. You wouldn't believe this. You know, Mary at the meeting, she gave me crap for not including her as part of that meeting. And then Rob gave me trouble because I didn't read his report in time. And then my boss yelled at me because I didn't respond a certain way," and so on. Any of you ever done that? Of course you have. Now, don't you just hate when the person at the other end of the phone does this? They go, "Oh, I'm so happy. You should be really grateful you have a job. Oh, did you talk to HR about that? You know, maybe you shouldn't have talked to your boss that way." What happens when people do that to you and problem solve your stuff? You get angry. It makes your blood want to boil, and you want to bop them on the head and say, "Shut up and just listen to me." All you want is acknowledgement. You don't want them to problem solve your stuff. Part of dealing with change that is uncomfortable is just acknowledging. Now, one of the things as a leader is we have to be at peace about is that acknowledging does not mean agreement. We do not need to agree with something that's going on, and we don't need to validate it, but we can just listen and hear it. So let me give you an example. If one of your team comes to you and talks to you and starts to complain about another coworker or colleague, it would not be appropriate for you as the leader to say, "Yeah, I hate working with Mary too, and you know, Sharif over there isn't a really great person either. I don't really like them," and get into that whole piece of dialogue. That's not appropriate. But you can certainly acknowledge and say, "Hey, it sounds like you're having a rough time working with these people." It doesn't mean you have to agree or validate their response. Now, here's a magic wand, and this is something that I found very valuable. If you ever catch people repeating themselves, what that usually means is they don't feel heard. And one of the ways that you can make them feel heard is to acknowledge what is going on for them. So I have 3 questions on my desk, and they're more there for me than the people that come to me. And the 3 questions help me decide whether I'm going to problem solve or acknowledge. The first question is, do you need me to problem solve this for you? The second question is, do you need me to help you problem solve this? And the third question I have, do you need me to just listen? And I know from this, sometimes I even have to go into my boss's office and say, "Don't problem solve this for me. I just need you to listen. I just need to unload." Because it's better for me to unload with you than with my team. So if you use those 3 questions, they will guide you and help you get unstuck from problem solving all the time. Now, the third step of our process to develop our resilience intelligence is the ability to look at problems as challenges. And remember, we want to keep timing in this, because sometimes you want to be stuck in the problem. But we want to also be able to try to turn negativity into positivity as appropriate. So picture yourself standing in the hall talking to 3 of your colleagues. And your boss comes up to you and says, "Hey, I need to see." Now, here are 5 questions that I found useful to change a pessimistic response to a more optimistic response. The first question I usually ask is there an alternative explanation? There probably is. If your boss is always calling you into the office because you've done something wrong, I can guarantee you're probably not going to be in that job for a while. So that's one thing that you can use on yourself or others. And last but not least, this is one of my favorites. Does X have to lead to Y? So does my boss Brian calling me into his office mean that I've done something wrong? Most likely not. It almost becomes laughable when you try to ground it in that sort of logic. Because again, my boss calls me into his office a lot. 9 times out of 10, I've probably done nothing wrong. He's probably just wanting to ask me a question or to do something, and that's probably your experience as well. The thing to know is that acknowledgement can move people to action. You don't need to problem solve everything. Now, the 4th step to help us get unstuck and to develop our resilience intelligence is the ability to be solution-focused in our thinking. Many years ago, I worked in a federal penitentiary, and I worked with a number of inmates, and I did life skills workshops for inmates, and 2 inmates used to come by and visit me all the time. So I asked Mark, I said, Mark, what stopped you from stabbing Trevor? Because that's the skill I can build. That's the thing I can work with on him. Because guess what? He's going to get out of jail, and I don't want him to stab people. So if I can build that skill of not stabbing people, that's the solution focus part. You know, what stopped you from doing that? And I'm sure if you reflect back on your own life, you've been in meetings, or you've been dealing with in-laws, or friends, or family, where they've done things that have made you really angry. And you've responded a certain way and you didn't like the way you responded. What I've learned is this, is that if you want to change your reaction, or you want to coach others to respond differently, focus on the exceptions. Move to solution-focused thinking. So I'm going to give you 5 questions that you can use that will help you become solution-focused when you're working with people. And again, problem-focused thinking is good. You know, why did the boat leak? Let's plug that hole. But to be solution-focused thinking, we want to take it up a level and start to focus on solutions. So you want to train yourself to look for exceptions and focus on what is useful. Don't always drill down into the problem. And you can do this in the context of your health, in your wealth, in your work, and certainly in your family and your love life. You can look at all those areas and focus on the solutions that are working in some and move them to another area. I'd like to close with a story with someone who's inspired me in my work over the years. Viktor Frankl was a neurologist and psychologist who lived in Vienna during the Second World War. He was incarcerated for 3 years in Dachau and Auschwitz concentration camp. He also wrote a book about his time in the camp called Man's Search for Meaning, and I actually prefer the Austrian title to his book, which is Saying Yes to Life in Spite of Everything. I mean, if that's not a motto to live by, I don't know what is. Viktor Frankl said that everything can be taken from a man or woman, but one thing, the last of human freedoms: to choose one's attitude in a given circumstance, to choose one's own way. Now, while most of us will never be faced with that type of circumstance, we are faced with situations daily that require us to change our attitude and to change our response. And no matter how hard I can try, and I do try, I can't control everything. My life would be so much easier if people just did what I said and did what I wanted them to do. But the reality is they can't, and I can't change others. So remember, the wave is the wave, the change is the change. It's our individual response that determines how successful we're going to be at building our capacity to be resilient and building our resilience intelligence. I really believe that if we make things too complicated, we just won't do them. So while the frameworks, the plans, the budgets are all important, it's our day-to-day interactions with others that will make the biggest difference in your career and in your work life. My challenge to you tonight is that when something disruptive happens, try a different response. Help yourself get unstuck. Use that neocortex to your advantage and choose a different response, and watch your life change. Thank you.